For presenting a single meal, I of course don't just want to output the text. Instead, I think it makes sense to create a new widget for a single list item here, because it'll be a more complex structure, a more complex widget composition of a couple of built-in widgets, and therefore I don't want to clutter this sub-widget tree here in the category meals screen, but instead create a new item or a new widget, just as we did it for a category item, where we also have a separate widget for displaying the categories in our grid of categories. So let's add a meal item here maybe. And now there is one thing which I want to improve about our folder structure before we continue. We have a couple of widgets which we use as screens. We have these two widgets to be precise. Then we have widgets which we use as part of other widgets. And that's of course a core difference, a totally different way of using widgets. Both are normal widgets. A screen widget also is just a class that extends stateless or stateful widget. But the way we use these widgets, of course, is totally different. So here it would make sense to create more subfolders to make it clearer which widgets and which files contain which kind of widget. So here we could add a widgets subfolder for these normal widgets, which we include into other widgets, and then a screens subfolder for the screen-like widgets. And then we can move categories screen and category meals screen into the screens folder, and category item and meal item Dart into the widgets folder. And the dummy data Dart and the main Dart file will stay where they are. I think we can definitely keep those on the root level, though you could also create some data folder for the dummy data if you wanted to. Now we will need to fix a couple of imports, like here in main Dart. Category meals screen is now found in the screen folder, so we need to update our import to screens folder to point at that folder. And the same is of course true for the categories screen Dart file. In the category item Dart file, there we also point at the category meals screen Dart file. So there we first of all need to go up one level with 2 dots, and then into the screens folder, and then into the category meals screen Dart file. And in our screens Dart files here, the dummy data is found one level above, so we need 2 dots here. And the category item is also found one level above, but then in the widgets folder. And in the category meals screen file, dummy data is found one level above. With all that fixed, now we can work on the meal item. And a meal item is simply another stateless widget here in the end. I'll name it meal item. And as always, you need to import material Dart from the Flutter package. Now, how should a meal item look like? And remember, this is simply the widget we use as part of our list of meals we're outputting once we selected a category. So how should such a list item look like? Obviously, you can style and build this in whichever way you want. Here's just one suggestion, which also will use a couple of new features, new widgets, new ways of configuring widgets, which we haven't used before in the course. Because that's of course also the core goal, or one core goal of this course. I want to give you many examples of how you can build Flutter apps and how you can work with the Flutter widgets. I'll start by adding an inkwell. And we did the same for the category item to have a clickable item where we also have this ripple effect. I want to have that effect here too, so inkwell makes a lot of sense. On tap, I want to make sure that we trigger some method which then actually shows us the detail page for the selected recipe. So here I'll add a new method which doesn't return anything, which I'll name select meal. And for now, I don't do anything in here. We'll add the logic later. I'll just connect it to OnTap for the moment. Now the inkwell will not just have a tap effect, but should also have, of course, a child, which is the actual widget that's wrapped by the inkwell. And there I'll use a card, so this built-in card widget Flutter offers. Now in that card, or on that card, I want to override the default shape by setting the shape argument. And with the shape argument, we can change the way this card looks. Instead of having a rectangle, we can get a rectangle with rounded corners, where we can define how strong the rounding effect should be, and so on. And indeed, that's what I want here. So for the shape, I'll set a rounded rectangle border object. because shape, if you check it, needs a shape border type, and shape border actually is created by rounded rectangle border. This gives you a shape border type as well. And rounded rectangle border takes one important argument, the border radius you want to have for your corners. So this is a typical pattern of how you can assign rounded corners to certain widgets, like the card widget in this case. And border radius in turn needs a border radius object, but there, for border radius, I'll use the circular constructor and then set a radius of 15. And this will now give us rounded corners on this card with a radius of 15. So that's the shape of the card. Besides the shape, I'll set the elevation to 4 to have a little bit more shadow behind the card, and a margin with edge insets all of 10, so that we have more margin around every element, around every meal here. With that, we can add a child, so the content inside of the card. And there I want to have a column, because I want to have multiple widgets above each other, on top of each other, so to say. Now, as you learned, column takes a children argument, and there we provide a list of widgets that should be part of that column. The first widget I'll add is the stack widget, another built-in widget which allows us to add items on top of each other in a three-dimensional space. So you can have an image with a title on top of the image, so as part of the image, so to say. And that's exactly the effect I want here, by the way. I want to display the image of the recipe, and on top of that image, I also want to show the title. Stack takes a couple of children, which are the child widgets that are placed on top of each other, and the first child widget will be my image. Now, I'll not create the image directly like this. Instead, I also want to have rounded corners on the image. Otherwise, it will not look good in that rounded corners card. Because if you would put an image with normal corners, without rounded corners, into that card with rounded corners, the image corners would basically overlap the card and you would not see the rounded corners effect on the card. And therefore, you need to clip the image, which means you have to move it into a certain form. You want to add rounded corners there as well. Now, you can't set rounded corners directly on an image. That's simply not supported. But you can use another widget to wrap it around your image widget to basically cut off or clip the corners of the image so that you have that feeling of having rounded corners, because the image is simply forced into that form. You do this with clip R rect. Now, this is a widget which is also part of Flutter. You don't use it that often, and the name certainly looks a bit strange. But this is a widget which you can use to basically use any other widget as a child and force it into a certain form. For example, into a widget where the top corners are rounded. So clip R rect indeed does take a border radius, just like rounded rectangle border did for the card. Here we could use rounded rectangle border instead of clip R rect, because card supports this shape argument and then handles the rounding internally. Here clip R rect needs to be used as a helper widget because image does not support this internally. Now, the value for border radius here, however, is also border radius, but then not circular, but only allows me to set the radius for each corner separately. And I only want to round the corners on the top left and top right, because these will be the corners that would overlap across our card corners. Why not the bottom corners as well? Because for our image, remember, it's part of a column. We'll have another element below the image. To be precise, I want to output information about the affordability and so on below the image. So the bottom corners of the image will not match the bottom corners of the card. The top borders will, and therefore we have to round the top borders. So here we can select the top left corner and set that to radius circular 15. So of course the same value I used up here. And then do the same for top right. Radius circular 15. So with that, we have that clipping set up. Now we have to define the child which should be clipped. And that's the image. And there we can use the .network constructor to create an image widget which reaches out to the network to fetch the image. Before in the course, we used image.asset to use a local image that's included in our app. Now that's simply not the case here. Every meal in our app has a URL that points at the image, and therefore we'll have to use that. Now, of course, the URL of the recipe of the meal is something we need as an input to our widget here. So let's add a couple of properties in general, I'd say. All the properties we need to properly display a meal in our list of meals. That will be the title. That will also be the image URL, of course. But it will also be, for example, the duration, which is an integer. And you can check the meal here, the meal model, to learn which property of our meals has which data type. Now, what I also want to display here in the list already is information about the complexity. So the type here is complexity, and for that to use it in this file, you need to import it from the models folder and there the meal.dart file. Now we can accept or use complexity as a type here in the meal item Dart file. I also want to use affordability. That's exported by the same file. And with that, I'd say we have a solid setup. Now let's add the constructor for meal item. And there you can use named or positional arguments. I'll use named arguments here, and I want to get the title, the image URL, the affordability, the complexity, of course, and the duration. Now, just as before, we can also add required in front of every argument here. This is available because we are already importing Flutter Material Dart, which unlocks the required decorator to make sure that meal items can't be created without these arguments. So now that we're getting this back down to the image network, we can of course simply use the image URL, which we're now getting as an argument when this widget is created. Now the image should also be configured. I want to set a height, for example, a fixed height of 250, so that the image never is bigger than that and we have the same image height on every recipe. And for the width, however, I want to set double infinity, so it should take all the width it can get. To fit the image nicely into that box which we create here, I'll also add the fit argument, because of course by default you might have an image that has an aspect ratio which would look distorted if you squeeze it into the dimensions you have here. And to automatically resize it or crop it such that it nicely fits into this box, the fix argument helps us, and we can set this to boxFit.cover, and this will both resize and crop the image so that it fits nicely into this container. And now before we continue, let's have a look at this. Let's save this and let's now go to category meals screen and there replace the text here with our meal item widget which we worked on. For that you need to add an import, of course, at the top. So import pointing at the widgets folder and there at the meal item Dart file. And with that we can create our meal item down here, and of course we now have to pass data to it, data about the selected meal. So the selected meal is of course category meals index, and now here we expect a title, for example, so we should access category meals index title and pass this title. Besides the title, we also want the image URL, so let's pass category meals for the selected index dot image URL. For the duration, we have to pass category meals for the selected index duration. For the affordability, unsurprisingly, we use category meals for the selected index affordability. And for the complexity, we use category meals for the selected index here in our item builder, and then complexity. With that, we're creating a meal item here, which we're outputting. Right now, we're not using title, duration, affordability, and complexity, but we should be seeing images at least. So let's save this and have a look. If you go back to the application, you should now see some images there through which you can scroll in all the categories. In some categories, we only have 1 or 2 elements, but in other categories, we have more elements. And there, once they're loaded, you should see these images. And that's, of course, pretty nice already. Looks quite delicious already, in my opinion. The next step, of course, is to make sure that we also show the title, that we make these tappable, and that we maybe also show some extra information regarding complexity and so on.